Shaquille O'Neal stood in the first-class line, his towering frame and simple attire creating a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding him. Behind him, a sharply dressed man looked at him with barely concealed disdain, his arrogance evident in every glance. What happened next left every passenger on the flight completely stunned and changed one person's life forever. Before we dive into this inspiring story, let us know where you're watching from. If you love stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for another meaningful tale coming your way. Tomorrow, the Los Angeles airport was bustling, like never before. That day, the PA system announced flights continuously. Passengers moved like rivers of humanity, and the sound of rolling luggage echoed across the gleaming floors. Amidst the chaos stood a tall, striking figure in the first-class line, Shaquille O'Neal. Shaquille was dressed in a simple gray hoodie, comfortable sweatpants, and oversized sneakers that matched his enormous stature. A large backpack slung over his shoulder looked like it had accompanied him on countless adventures. He stood there silently calm and composed, not trying to draw attention but becoming the center of it anyway. His presence wasn't flashy, but his friendly and approachable demeanor naturally made people gravitate toward him. Behind Shaquille was Ethan Carter, a successful businessman in his 40s. Ethan exuded confidence, sporting a meticulously tailored dark suit, polished leather shoes, and an expensive cologne that easily claimed the airspace around him. His every move was deliberate, whether adjusting his collar or running a hand through his hair as if to proclaim, "I'm someone important." As he noticed Shaquille standing in front of him, Ethan frowned. Shaquille's casual appearance seemed out of place in the first-class line, which Ethan regarded as a realm for the elite, successful, and powerful individuals like himself. After staring for a few seconds, Ethan sneered and muttered, just loud enough for Shaquille and those nearby to hear. "Looks like anyone can get into first class these days." A few people in line turned their heads slightly, but Shaquille remained unfazed. He simply shrugged as if the remark carried no weight at all. His calm demeanor only seemed to irritate Ethan further with a scoff. Ethan deliberately stepped closer, as if to assert his superiority in the space. Shaquille maintained his composure casually, stepping aside to make room for a family behind him. He didn't respond, didn't show any hint of annoyance, but it was this very silence that made Ethan even more uncomfortable in his mind. He began to justify why Shaquille could possibly be standing there. Maybe he got lucky, or maybe the ticket was a gift. No one in that line realized they were standing next to a legend, not just in sports, but also in living a life of humility and depth. And this story was only just beginning. Shaquille simply turned his head, flashing a gentle smile, just enough to maintain his usual calm demeanor. He replied in a deep, warm voice tinged with a touch of humor. "Seems like it." His unguarded, straightforward response made Ethan feel almost dismissed. A man like Ethan, accustomed to controlling situations and commanding attention, saw Shaquille's composure as nothing short of a subtle rejection. Ethan's face momentarily tightened as he straightened up, deliberately adjusting his tie with an exaggerated flourish, determined not to let this towering man get the upper hand. Ethan let out a dry chuckle and spoke with clear sarcasm. "What do you do to afford a first-class ticket, or was it a promotional giveaway?" A few nearby passengers glanced over, intrigued by the provocation. Shaquille, still wearing his signature smile, replied calmly, "I work in sports." Ethan squinted, his scrutinizing gaze betraying outright disdain. Shaquille's response only reinforced the stare stereotype forming in Ethan's mind. This man couldn't possibly be anyone significant with years of experience in the business world. Ethan had become adept at categorizing people based on their attire and speech to him. Shaquille was likely just an amateur athlete, perhaps a coach for a school team who had somehow lucked into a first-class ticket. Ethan laughed louder this time, as though Shaquille's response was the punchline of a joke. He emphasized each word, ensuring the entire line heard him. "Oh, sports, huh? Well, good for you. I guess those running and jumping jobs pay just enough to get you a seat here." The words running and jumping hung in the air like a veiled insult, dripping with the implication that Ethan viewed the sports industry as trivial, and beneath his self-perceived status, Shaquille, unfazed by the jab, gave a slight nod. Sometimes simplicity is enough. The response only irritated Ethan further. He wasn't used to being ignored in such a subtle yet powerful way. To Ethan, every conversation was an opportunity to dominate, to overwhelm the other person with his confidence and perceived superiority. But Shaquille refused to react in the way Ethan expected. Raising an eyebrow, Ethan decided to push further, his tone becoming sharper. "Don't you think there are places meant only for certain people, first class, for instance? Isn't it reserved for those who've actually made it in life?" Though the words were wrapped in a polite smile, the underlying meaning was clear. Ethan didn't believe Shaquille belonged here. He even leaned forward slightly as if to assert his authority. Shaquille met Ethan's gaze without a hint of anger or offense. His calm smile remained as he replied, "I think anyone can sit here as long as they have a ticket." A simple answer, yet one imbued with quiet strength, enough to momentarily throw Ethan off for a brief moment. Ethan seemed to realize that no matter how much he tried to provoke him, Shaquille wasn't going to budge, but instead of stopping, Ethan felt even more challenged. He thought to himself, "Does this guy think he's smarter than me? No way!" Ethan smirked again, crossing his arms over his chest, preparing for another round of verbal sparring. But before he could say more, the boarding line began to move. Both men stepped onto the plane, gearing up for a long journey, one that promised plenty of opportunities for their clash to escalate. And in the first-class cabin, this was just the beginning. The boarding line started moving, and Ethan stepped onto the plane with his trademark confidence. As he passed through the rows of economy seats, his eyes occasionally glanced at the cramped passengers as if to reaffirm that he belonged to a different class altogether. But the moment he reached the first-class cabin, his gaze froze at the sight of the man seated right next to him, Shaquille O'Neal. Ethan hesitated for a split second before shaking his head, trying to mask the irritation. Rising within him, he muttered loud enough for Shaquille to hear, "Unbelievable. Of all the seats in first class, I have to sit next to you?" Shaquille, adjusting his backpack, turned his head and offered a friendly smile. "Looks like we're travel buddies today." That calm, unguarded response felt like a subtle challenge. To Ethan, annoyed, he plopped into his seat and fastened his seatbelt with exaggerated movements, deliberately making noise as if to emphasize his displeasure. As the other passengers settled into their seats, Ethan scanned the cabin, seeking the attention of a flight attendant. He ordered a glass of water with ice, casting a sideways glance at Shill, his eyes saying, "You don't belong here, unable to bear." The silence, Ethan decided to break it, not to chat, but to provoke. He smirked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Sports, huh? What do you do? Teach basketball to kids or something?" Shaquille turned to him, still relaxed and unbothered by the jab. He replied slowly, as if recounting something entirely ordinary. Sometimes that simple response irritated Ethan even more. It felt as though he was facing someone who, either didn't know their place, or worse, was deliberately downplaying themselves to throw him off balance. Ethan chuckled derisively, twirling his glass of water. His gaze fixed on Shaquille interesting. I always thought people in sports had to hustle for attention. But you don't need to show off. Huh. Shaquille maintained his composed demeanor, tilting his head slightly to study Ethan before smiling gently. Some things don't need proven, people notice when it matters. The statement landed like a silent arrow, striking Eth more deeply than any direct confrontation could have. He burst out laughing, but his laughter was strained. Oh, really? See? I've always believed that in this world, if you don't flaunt what you've got, no one will ever notice. You, especially here, Ethan emphasized the words, especially here. Letting his gaze sweep across the luxurious first-class cabin, Shaquille didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a book, opening it with quiet ease, as though Ethan's entire tirade wasn't worth addressing. But that simple act only fueled Ethan's frustration in his mind. Shaquille's silence wasn't calm. It was veiled disdain. Ethan crossed his arms, his gaze sharp and calculating as a plan began forming in his head. Head, I'll make him understand who holds the power here. The flight had only just begun, but the silent clash between the two was already brewing, while Shaquille exuded unshakable tranquility. His eyes hinted that he had already anticipated Ethan's moves in some unspoken way. This wasn't just ATT tension-filled encounter between two people on a flight. It was a battle between opposing values, vanity, and humility, arrogance, and compassion. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was calm, yet between Shaquille and Ethan, an undercurrent of tension simmered like a dormant electrical charge waiting to ignite. Shaquille remained unperturbed, engrossed in the book he held, seemingly indifferent to the curious glances or the subtle tension radiating from the man seated beside him. Meanwhile, Ethan began to feel a growing irritation with this nonchalance. When the flight attendant started serving drinks, Ethan wasted no time asserting himself. Leaning back with a deliberate air, he called out loudly enough to command attention, a glass of Dom Perino champagne. "Thank you, make sure it's properly chilled after all this is first class." Ethan smirked with smug satisfaction, casting a sidelong glance at Shaquille, as if to declare, "This is how one lives in first class." He emphasized each word, making it clear that his presence here was a given, and everything luxurious in this space was inherently his domain. When it was Shaquille's turn, the flight attendant leaned in politely and asked, "What can I get for you?" Sir Shaquille looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips, and replied simply, "A bottle of water, please." That response was enough to elicit a derisive snort from Ethan. Shaking his head, his eyes filled with disdain, he remarked, "Water? You're serious? What a waste of a first-class seat." Shaquille merely shrugged, taking the bottle from the attendant and responding calmly, utterly unfazed sometimes. Simplicity is enough. Though delivered softly, those words landed like a direct hit to Ethan's inflated pride. He placed his champagne glass down with a touch more force than necessary, unable to mask his irritation. Simplicity to Ethan, the term was not only meaningless, but a weak excuse for those who lacked the ability to truly enjoy life. Raising an eyebrow, his tone deliberately cutting, Ethan retorted, "That's what people who don't know how to live say. Don't you think when you're here you should make the most of it? This is first class. Simplicity has no place here." Shaquille turned to face Ethan, his gaze steady and composed as though peering beyond the facade of confidence that Ethan wore. He nodded slightly and replied, "Everyone has their own way of living. I just prefer to enjoy what I truly need." The response only fueled Ethan's sense of challenge in his mind. Shaquille wasn't just disagreeing with him, but was indirectly criticizing the lifestyle he took such pride in. Ethan sipped his champagne, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Your words sound nice," Ethan said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "But don't you think humility is often just a mask? You seem pretty skilled at playing the simple man, but I wonder how genuine that is." Shaquille smiled, showing no reaction to the provocation. Setting his water bottle on the table, he replied slowly, "I don't need to prove anything to anyone. The way I live isn't meant to please others." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin seemed to grow heavier. Nearby passengers, while trying to appear uninterested, were clearly listening. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, not at Shaquille, but at the increasingly blatant sarcasm from Ethan. Noticing those looks, Ethan felt cornered, as though he had to emerge. Victorious, he pressed on, his tone dripping with self-satisfaction. "Well said, but do you know why this is called first class? It's for people who understand their worth. People who know how to enjoy their success, not for those who just spout cheap philosophy." Shaquille studied Ethan for a moment, as if deciding whether a response was even worth his time. Finally, he picked up his water, took a small sip, and replied, "True. Success isn't about what you show the world, it's about what you leave behind in others." Those words didn't just momentarily silence Ethan. They seemed to freeze the air in the cabin. The surrounding passengers, previously disinterest, now reacted more openly. A woman nearby nodded subtly in agreement, while an older businessman raised an eyebrow at Ethan with a look of clear disapproval. For a moment, Ethan appeared at a loss, as though he'd been dealt a blow he couldn't counter, but instead of retreating, he'd doubled down in Ethan's mind. This was no longer an ordinary conversation. It had become a battle he was determined to win. What Ethan didn't realize was that Shaquille had encountered far too many battles like this before he simply sat there, composed, waiting to see what Ethan would do next. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained quiet, but between Shaquille and Ethan, where words were like hidden arrows piercing through an unspoken confrontation, only they could truly feel. Ethan took a deep breath, picked up his champagne glass, and sipped it, as if to bolster his confidence before speaking. "Listen," he began, his tone like that of a teacher lecturing. "A student's success doesn't come naturally. It's about proving your worth. If you don't showcase what you've achieved, no one will know who you are in this world. Attention is everything. If you don't stand out, you'll be forgotten." Shaquille looked at him, his gaze as calm as a still, deep lake. After a moment of reflection, he placed his water bottle down and asked softly but sharply, "So, Ethan, what is your worth?" The question landed like a stone cast into the stream of Ethan's confidence. He paused for a moment, his eyes flickering with doubt, but he quickly regained his composure, leaning back in his seat. He smirked. My worth is everything I've achieved. Money, status, everything I own, they're the clearest proof of my success." Shaquille remained silent for a few seconds, his gaze steady on Ethan. Then he shook his head slightly and replied, his voice gentle but weighty. "Those things don't define you. Money and status are just what you have not. Who you are, how you treat others, that's what truly matters." Ethan frowned. feeling as though he'd been challenged on a level he wasn't used to. He chuckled dryly, but the confidence in his laugh had diminished. That's just old philosophy. Do you think people will see you as successful just because you're kind? No, Shaquille, the world doesn't work like that. This is a battle, and the stronger, smarter ones win. Shaquille tilted his head, his eyes assessing a different Ethan, no longer a confident man, but someone hiding something deeper within. He replied, I don't think success is a battle. If you see everything as a competition, you'll never feel satisfied, but if you find meaning in helping others, you'll realize it's not always about winning. Ethan laughed louder this time, but the laughter carried both sarcasm and a hint of unease, meaning, you really think the world operates on kindness. You're dreaming. Shaquille, in the real world, people only care about results, and I don't need anyone to teach me the meaning of life. I know exactly what I'm doing. Shaquille didn't flinch at those words. He remained calm, his expression serene, though his gaze seemed to pierce through the facade Ethan wore. He said, maybe you're right. Maybe the world out there only cares about results. But when everything fades away, when you're left alone with yourself, what will truly give you peace? Money status, or the relationships you've built? The question wasn't a judgment, but a mirror held up for Ethan to see himself. He fell silent for a few seconds, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but he quickly reclaimed his usual arrogance. I don't need peace. I need success, and success is everything I've accomplished, he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had. Before Shaquille smiled faintly, choosing not to argue further, he picked up his water bottle, took a small sip, and turned his gaze to the airplane window. Your success might make you proud, but how you treat others is what people will remember about you. He said, his voice quiet yet resonant like a lasting reminder. Ethan felt as though Shaquille had touched something deep inside him, but instead of admitting it, he simply crossed his arms, his expression trying to appear indifferent. Yet deep down, Shaquille's words echoed, reminding him that perhaps he had missed something truly important. The first-class cabin returned to silence, but for Ethan, it wasn't peace. It was a confrontation with himself. The conversation between Shaquille and Ethan, which initially started as a casual exchange, had now caught the attention of the surrounding passengers, though. No one wanted to appear too obvious. Some cast sidelong glances toward the two, their eyes a mix of curiosity and amusement. A few passengers nodded subtly at Shaquille's insightful responses, while others began to direct disapproving looks at Ethan, who continued to exude arrogance. Ethan noticed he wasn't used to being criticized or becoming the center of scrutiny. His usual confidence began to waver as he realized the judging eyes of the passengers' people he assumed should have admired him instead. He sat up straight as if to reclaim control of the conversation and spoke loudly, his tone dripping with sarcasm. So what about you? Shaquille, does a bottle of water and a few cheap philosophical lines make you better than me? The statement rang out like a chawl intentionally adding tension to the atmosphere. A few passengers turned fully to face them, their expressions showing clear disapproval. A middle-aged woman seated nearby frowned in irritation, but remained silent. Shaquille, as always, did not show anger. He placed the water bottle on the small table in front of him, turning to look at Ethan with a calm but resolute gaze. After a few moments of silence, he replied in a steady, measured voice, I'm not here to prove I'm better than anyone. I'm just here to be myself. The gentle response felt like another blow to Ethan's ego. He forced a strained smile, trying to mask the rising discomfort within him. But the eyes of the passengers around him, now more focused on him than before, were impossible to ignore. Narrowing his eyes, Ethan gave a mocking smirk before continuing his attack. So you think just being yourself is enough? The world doesn't work that way. Shaquille, if you don't prove your worth, no one cares who you are. You're living in some fantasy where people judge each other by their hearts instead of their achievements. How naive Shaquille didn't rush to respond. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze drifting out the airplane window as though deep in thought. The first-class cabin was so quiet that the hum of the plane's engines became distinctly audible. Finally, he turned back, speaking slowly but with weight. You're right, Ethan. The world can be harsh and unfair at times, but I've learned that no matter the circumstances, how we treat others is what truly matters. Your accomplishments might earn admiration, but it's your heart that makes people remember you. The statement landed like a declaration, not meant to refute Ethan, but to affirm a deeper truth. The surrounding passengers now, unrestrained and showing their agreement, nodded slightly or exchanged knowing looks. An elderly man sitting nearby even whispered to his wife, "He's absolutely right." Ethan, realizing he was losing the upper hand, began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. He glanced around, searching for an ally among the first-class passengers, but the eyes fixed on him now carried a mix of annoyance and judgment. He scoffed, forcing a confident facade. "Nice speech, but let's be realistic, Shaquille. The world doesn't run on kindness, only the strong wind. You can say all the pretty words you want, but at the end of the day, who cares about that?" When they're not getting ahead, Shaquille leaned forward, slightly resting his elbows on the small table, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. His voice, though quiet, was firm. "I care, Ethan, and I think a lot of others do too. Because in the end, when you look back on your life, what makes you happy won't be the things you've accumulated, but the moments you've created. For others, you'll realize that the things you achieve are temporary, but compassion lasts forever." Shaquille's words hit Ethan like a powerful blow to the mind. Even though he didn't want to admit it, a part of him recognized the truth in those words. But instead of conceding, Ethan felt an overwhelming need to defend his pride. He sat up straighter, preparing to respond, but this time, the sharp words he was known for eluded him. The first-class cabin was heavy with tension. No one spoke but the passengers. Expressions made it clear they had taken Shaquille's side. Ethan realized that no matter how hard he tried, he was steadily losing his footing in this conversation. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew heavy after Shaquille's profound words. Ethan, despite his efforts to maintain composure, could no longer hide the confusion that began to surface in his eyes. The surrounding passengers, initially curious, now looked at Shaquille with agreement and admiration. Ethan started to feel like an outsider in a space he had believed he controlled. At that moment, the chief flight attendant approached with a professional demeanor and a polite smile. She bowed slightly toward Akil and said, "Mr. O'Neal, your connecting flight has been confirmed. The captain also sends his regards and admiration to you." Her words were like a bomb dropped into the already tense air. The entire cabin seemed to freeze. Several passengers turned their heads to look at Shaquille, their expressions shifting to astonishment, as if they had just realized something extraordinary. Ethan was stunned. His mind raced, struggling to piece together everything that had just unfolded. The name O'Neal echoed in his head like an awakening bell. He turned to Shaquille, his eyes wide, unable to hide his shock. "Shaquille O'Neal! You're Shaquille O'Neal!" Shaquille, still wearing his familiar gentle smile, nodded slowly. "I'm Shaq." Those three simple words rendered Ethan speechless in an instant, every memory of the name. Shaquille O'Neal flashed through his mind. Basketball legend, NBA champion, successful businessman, and a figure known for his generosity. Ethan couldn't say a word. He looked Shaquille up and down as if trying to reconcile the casually dressed man in a hoodie sitting beside him with the global icon. The arrogance that had once gleamed in Ethan's eyes was now replaced by confusion and embarrassment. Shaquille gazed at Ethan, his demeanor calm, but his eyes carried a quiet gravity. He didn't demand an apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but his presence alone spoke volumes around them. Other passengers began to whisper. A woman seated a row behind leaned toward her husband and murmured, "I can't believe it, that's Shaquille O'Neal. He's so composed." An older gentleman nodded, smiling with admiration. "He's not just great on the basketball court, his character is remarkable too." Ethan heard those words. The shame within him grew heavier. He fumbled for something to say, some justification for his earlier behavior. After a few seconds of stammering, he finally blurted out, his voice trembling. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were. If I had known, I wouldn't have said those things." Shaquille didn't show anger. He shook his head slightly, his voice warm but firm. "That doesn't matter, Ethan. How you treat others shouldn't depend on who they are." Those words were like a mirror reflecting all of Ethan's arrogance and pettiness throughout the flight. The surrounding passengers fell silent, but their gazes carried judgment as they rested on Ethan. Ethan bowed his head, unable to look Shaquille or anyone else in the eye. He felt as if every glance in the first-class cabin weighed heavily on him. His heart sank not only from humiliation, but also from the undeniable truth. He had been wrong. Shaquille smiled gently, as if signaling the end of the conversation. He picked up his book and resumed reading, leaving Ethan to stew in his embarrassment and turbulent thoughts. The cabin gradually returned to its previous hum of quiet activity, but no one could forget the lesson they had just witnessed. A person's worth isn't measured by their fame or status, but by how they treat those around them. Ian, sitting silently beside Shaquille, felt trapped in his own thoughts. Little did he know what was to come would change him even more. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained tense, even as Shaquille returned to his seat with a book in hand. Ethan, sitting stiffly beside him, seemed trapped in an invisible box, the stares of the surrounding passengers forming walls that pressed tightly against him. He lowered his head, his voice trembling but attempting to maintain an air of confidence. I didn't know who you were. If I had, I wouldn't have said that." Though the explanation seemed reasonable at first glance, it only deepened the shame welling up inside Ethan. His words were not merely an admission of fault, but an unintentional confession that he judged people based on status and reputation. Shaquille, without looking away, locked eyes with Ethan. His gaze wasn't angry, but stern like a teacher, imparting a vital lesson to a student. He spoke with a calm yet cutting tone that doesn't matter. You should treat everyone kindly, not just those who are famous or wealthy. Those words struck Ethan's pride like a blow. He felt as if he'd been stripped back there in front of everyone with nowhere to hide. Some nearby passengers, though silent, conveyed everything with their expressions: admiration for Shaquille and disappointment in Ethan. Ethan tried to respond, but his voice caught in his throat. It felt as though the entire world had come to a halt, everything around him blurred, leaving only Shaquille's words echoing in his mind. "You to treat everyone kindly." He bowed his head, his hand reflexively gripping the champagne flute before him, forcing a faint smile to mask his discomfort. Ethan mumbled softly, "I didn't think this would escalate like it did. I didn't mean to offend you." Shaquille nodded without interrupting, allowing Ethan the space to continue taking a deep breath. Ethan glanced around the first-class cabin, avoiding Shaquille's piercing gaze. His voice, tinged with embarrassment and unease, wavered as he pressed on. Maybe I've gotten used to valuing things by what people have. It's like a habit, but that doesn't mean I meant to come across as arrogant. It's just, I don't know any other way." Shaquille studied him for a moment, his gaze softening slightly. His response came in a warm but resolute tone. "Habits aren't an excuse for how we treat others, but habits can change, Ethan. We always have the choice to be better." Those words, though, free of reproach, reflected Ethan's true self back at him like a mirror. He felt a wave of shame rise within him, threatening to wash away the arrogant facade he had so carefully construed. Ethan sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the small table before him. In his mind, images of his past interactions with others played out one by one. He recalled the employees he had berated, the servers he had dismissed, and people like Shaquille he had looked down upon simply because their appearances didn't align with the standards he held in that quiet moment. Something inside Ethan seemed to crack. It wasn't just his pride, it was the barrier that had kept him from seeing the deeper, more human values he had ignored for so long. Shaquille, noticing Ethan's introspection, didn't press further. Instead, he turned back to his book, giving Ethan the space to grapple with his own thoughts. The first-class cabin gradually returned to its usual calm pages of books, rustling soft music spilling from passengers' headphones and the faint hum of flight attendants' carts. But for Ethan, the weight in the air remained heavy. Each passing moment made him feel smaller, as though his arrogance were being peeled away layer by layer. He couldn't stop replaying Shaquille's words in his head. "You should treat everyone kindly." Those words echoed like a mantra, forcing Ethan to confront himself to face the mistakes he had long dismissed as normal. For the first time in years, Ethan felt that it wasn't his wealth or status on trial. It was who he truly was, and the verdict was being rendered by no one but himself. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was no longer noisy, but a heavy tension lingered like a thin fog weaving through the rows of seats. Ethan sat still, gripping his now empty champagne glass. He stared at the table in front of him as though trying to avoid the gaze of the surrounding passengers. Shaquille, sitting next to him, said nothing further. He opened the book in his hands, his eyes skimming the lines with a calm detachment, as if their earlier conversation had left no mark. Yet it was precisely that silence that felt like an undeniable reminder to Ethan. The other passengers, after their brief murmurs and sideways glances, gradually returned to their own affairs, but no one was entirely indifferent. A few glances still flickered in Ethan's direction, caring. Expressions he couldn't ignore, disapproval. Perhaps even a tinge of pity. Ethan felt exposed, not just by the eyes of those around him, but by his own self-awareness. Shaquille's words echoed relentlessly in his mind. "You should treat everyone with kindness. Habits can change. We always have the choice to become better people." He had never imagined that a conversation which initially seemed trivial could leave him in such a state, confused, embarrassed, and overwhelmed with introspection. He replayed every moment of the flight from his sarcastic remarks when he first saw Shaquille in the boarding line to each cutting comment about simplicity and human worth. Is that really how I behaved? He wondered, a wave of disgust for himself washing over him for a moment. Ethan thought about everything he had accomplished in his life. The achievements, the figures in his bank account, the luxurious possessions he owned. They had once been his greatest sources of pride, but now, under the weight of Shaquille's words, they seemed meaningless. All of this, does it truly make me happy? He glanced at Shaquille. The tall, unassuming, and composed man remained absorbed in his book, seemingly unconcerned by the turmoil unfolding within Ethan. That very indifference made the contrast between them even. Starker Shaquille didn't need to prove anything, didn't need to flaunt anything. Yet his presence exuded an undeniable strength. Ethan felt as though he were sitting next to a giant mirror, reflecting every flaw, every arrogance, and the smallness of his own existence. He sighed softly, trying to find a way out of the storm of thoughts engulfing him. But each time he tried to push them aside, the memory of their earlier conversation grew clearer. Shaquille's words were more than just advice. They were a profound reminder that the path Ethan was on might not lead to where he truly wanted to go. For the first time in years, Ethan felt lost. The successes he once took pride in now felt like scattered pieces, unable to fill the emptiness within him. The gentle sound of Shaquille turning a page at beside him. But to Ethan, it felt like a drum beat pounding in his mind. A reminder that life always offered new chapters. If he had the courage to change, he lowered his head, his hands clenching into fists as if wrestling with himself, yet deep within a new thought began to take root. Perhaps this was the moment to change. The first class. Cabin remained silent, but within Ethan's mind the chaos was giving way to an awakening. He didn't know if he had. The bravery to do something different. But for the first time, he began to ask himself, if I started over, who would I become? After sitting silently for a long time, wrestling with himself, Ethan felt the weight of his pride begin to give way to a new sensation, a necessity to admit his mistakes. He stared at his hands, as if searching for answers in the veins visible under the cabin lights of the airplane. I have to say something. If I don't, I'll be trapped in this feeling forever, he told himself. Ethan took a deep breath and turned toward Shaquille, who was engrossed in his book, his demeanor calm, as if he had completely forgotten Ethan's presence. It felt like Shaquille was offering him a choice. No pressure, no expectations. Finally, Ethan decided to break the silence. His voice trembled slightly, but each word carried a rare sincerity. Shaquille, I want to apologize. Shaquille stopped reading, gently closed his book and placed it on the tray table. He said nothing, only looking at Ethan with an expectant gaze, as though giving him the space to express everything he needed to say. Ethan continued, his voice steadier now, but brimming with emotion. It's not about who you are. It's about how I acted. I was arrogant and shallow. I didn't realize that the way I treated you, and probably many others, said so much about the kind of person I was. He paused briefly as if to regain his composure, then added his tone, softening. I thought I knew everything, but I was wrong, and I'm sorry for that. Shaquille regarded Ethan with an expression free of judgment instead. His gaze reflected understanding and compassion. He nodded slowly and replied in a calm voice. Apologizing is a good start, Ethan. What's more important is what you do next. The simplicity of Shaquille's response carried the weight of profound wisdom. Ethan looked at him. Surprise evident in his eyes, he hadn't expected his apology to be received so calmly. No reproach, no anger. Just a gentle reminder that real change lies in actions, not words. The first-class cabin settled into a comfortable silence. The other passengers, though aware of the conversation, refrained from interfering. A few nodded subtly, as if agreeing with Shaquille's words. Ethan lowered his head, feeling as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. At the same time, he recognized that his apology was merely the first step in a long journey of self-improvement. He spoke again, his voice quieter, almost as if it were meant only for Shaquille. Thank you, Shaquille. I truly appreciate that you've given me the chance to reflect on myself, and I'll try to be better. Shaquille smiled a simple, warm smile. He patted Ethan's shoulder gently, a gesture of encouragement. We all make mistakes, Ethan. What matters is what we learn from them. I believe you can do it. Ethan didn't reply immediately, but Shaquille's words lit a spark within him. For the first time in years, he felt motivated to change, to become a better person. Shaquille returned to his book, while Ethan remained seated, his gaze shifting to the airplane window beyond the glass. The vast sky stretched endlessly, the stars twinkling like a quiet reminder that anyone can start anew if they truly desire it. That conversation didn't just change Ethan. It left a profound impact on the passengers who witnessed it. Though no one said it out loud, they all knew they had learned a valuable lesson about humility, forgiveness, and the true essence of humanity. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew lighter, but Shaquille's words still resonated, rippling like waves on a calm lake. Ethan sat still silent, his eyes fixed on his hands clasped together. What he felt now was no longer mere shame. It was an expanding sense of understanding, an awakening unlike anything he'd experienced before. Shaquille continued, his voice warm and steady, each word sinking deep into Ethan's consciousness. Sometimes we try to prove something simply because we're afraid of being overlooked, but you don't have to do that. True success isn't something you can measure or showcase to others. True success lies in how we lift others up, not in how we push them down. Those words felt like a beam of light piercing through the veil Ethan had built around himself. In his mind, moments from his life began to rewind like a film reel. He remembered the times he had sought to prove his worth by belittling others, as mocking less successful colleagues, flaunting his possessions to earn admiration. Why did I do that? He asked himself. The answer came swiftly, because I was afraid they wouldn't respect me. Ethan looked up at Shaquille, his eyes now devoid of defiance. Instead, they held a glimmer of introspection, as if seeking guidance. He asked softly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "But how do I change that? I've spent my whole life believing that if I'm not standing above others, I'll be seen as weak." Shaquille set his book down, once more, leaning forward toward Ethan. His voice gentle, but resolute. Change doesn't happen in a day. Ethan, it's a journey, but the first step is always recognizing where you've gone wrong. You've done that today, and that's the most important thing. He paused briefly, his gaze steady on Ethan. And remember, Strength isn't about standing above others. It's about being able to bend down and help someone else rise. When you do that, you're not just changing them. You're changing yourself. Shaquille's words, soft yet powerful, stirred something deep within Ethan. It wasn't a feeling of being coerced, but an invitation to see life through a new lens, a lens of kindness and empathy. Ethan exhaled deeply. But this time it wasn't a sigh of frustration, it was one of release. For the first time he allowed himself to acknowledge his mistakes, and instead of feeling weaker, he felt a surprising sense of relief. He spoke his voice slow, but weighted with meaning. "Thank you, Shaquille. I think this is a lesson I've been missing for far too long." Shaquille smiled and nodded. "We all learn something new every day." "Ethan, the important part is being willing to accept and apply it. If you can do that, you won't just change your life. You'll impact the lives of so many around you." Ethan didn't reply, but he nodded a slow, deliberate nod, filled with determination for the first time in his life. A glimmer of hope stirred within him. Shaquille returned to his book, though the faint smile on his lips lingered. He knew this conversation had left a deep imprint on Ethan, and to Shaquille that mattered more than any title or accolade he'd ever achieved. Ethan gazed out of the airplane window at the vast expanse of sky stretching before him. Shaquille's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that a meaningful life isn't about standing above others, but about being willing to lift them up. And at that moment, Ethan realized he stood at the threshold of change, not just for the present, but for the future as well, when the flight crew's announcement signaled that the plane was preparing to the land. Ethan felt as though he had just awakened from a long dream. But this dream wasn't an illusion. It was an inner journey that had unfolded before him, revealing truths he had never considered before. Ethan turned his head to look at Shaquille. The towering man who maintained an aura of calm composure, Shaquille was carefully folding his book. His eyes reflected a serene glow, as though this flight carried no tension at all. The plane landed smoothly and passengers began standing up to retrieve their luggage. Ethan followed suit slowly, but his emotions were entirely different from what they had been when he boarded the plane as the two stepped out. Of the first-class cabin, Ethan trailed Shaquille. The man with his imposing figure and unassuming demeanor walked effortlessly without seeking attention, yet managed to draw everyone's gaze in the airport terminal. A few people recognized Shaquille. They hesitantly approached, asking, "Are you Shaquille O'Neal? Can we take a picture with you?" Shaquille leaned down, offering a genuine smile, and agreed. Immediately, he signed autographs, posed for photos, and chatted briefly with each person, showing neither haste nor annoyance. His demeanor was entirely different from what Ethan had expected of celebrities. No pretension, no detachment, just a man using his time to bring joy to others. Ethan stood a few steps away quietly, observing a strange mix of admiration and regret welled up inside him. He thought to himself, "I've met a legend, not just on the basketball court, but in life itself." He glanced down at his hands, still gripping the straps of his bag tightly. Shaquille's words from the flight echoed in his mind like a constant reminder. Strength isn't about standing above others. It's about bending down to help others rise. Ethan sighed, but this time it was a breath of relief. He knew he had made mistakes, but he also realized he could do something to make amend. Their encounter wasn't just a chance meeting on a flight for Ethan. It was a turning point, a moment, to start a new chapter in his life, where success wasn't measured by material wealth, but by the value he could bring to others. Shaquille turned back to look at Ethan. One last time smiling and nodding a silent farewell, Ethan returned the nod slowly, silently, vowing to himself that he would do better. The story closed, leaving a profound message for those who witnessed it. Success isn't about what you flaunt. It's about the values you leave behind in the lives of others. Sometimes the greatest changes begin in the smallest moments. A flight, a conversation, and someone strong enough to make you pause and reflect. The story of Shaquille O'Neal and Ethan Carter wasn't just an unexpected meeting on a plane. It was a lesson in humility, compassion, and the way we measure a person's true worth in life. Have you ever found yourself in a situation like Ethan's where preconceived notions made you overlook someone's true value? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story and found its lesson and meaningful, don't forget to like and share the video to spread this message to more people. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.